Most folks around here still remember the winter when the wind cut sharper than any blade, when cabins cracked under the cold, and men who'd survived a dozen harsh seasons finally met their match. But there was one place in that valley, one lone cabin glowing warm as August, while the world outside froze solid. And the man behind that miracle? An old hermit named Silas Merrick, the fellow everyone laughed at when he built a shed made entirely of glass. They called it foolish. They called it a coffin. Yet that strange little structure kept his home at 80 degrees while the frontier tried to kill everything it touched. Stay with me, because what Silas discovered out here in the wild is more than a story. It's a lesson every modern homesteader, gardener, and weekend survivor can use today. Now let me take you to the beginning. Before the blizzards came, before the mockery faded, before people learned that on the frontier, wisdom doesn't always roar like thunder. Sometimes it whispers, just loud enough for a stubborn old man to hear. Part 1. The Man Who Lived Close to the Wind. Silas Merrick was already past 60 when our story begins, though no one could agree on his exact age. He was the kind of man the frontier shapes slowly, like wind carving canyons, quiet, weathered, carved by time rather than defeated by it. His cabin stood at the foot of a crooked ridge in northern Wyoming, where winter storms rolled down with the weight of mountains and summer heat baked the earth to stone. Most people in the valley thought Silas was half wild, half mad, and fully unnecessary to their daily lives. He didn't drink at the saloon, didn't bother with town gossip, and didn't complain about the government land office like everyone else. He simply lived, the same way the pines clung to the rocks. Ever since his wife died nearly 2 decades earlier, Silas had chosen solitude like other men choose company. He hunted just enough to fill his smokehouse, tilled just enough soil to keep beans growing, and spoke just enough words to remind folks he still remembered how to talk. But beneath that heavy silence of his lived a mind sharper than most suspected. You see, Silas wasn't just surviving out here. He was studying the land the way a craftsman studies his tools. He tracked wind the way others tracked deer. He read sunlight by the length of shadows. He understood cold, not as an enemy, but as a force with habits. And on the frontier, understanding a force is the first step to mastering it. People didn't see that side of him, though. They saw a loner patching old clothes, gathering scrap lumber, and saving every piece of broken glass he ever found. They saw someone out of step with the rest of them, a stubborn mule of a man who didn't follow the unwritten rules. In a land that rewarded conformity with survival, Silas insisted on doing things his own way. And the valley held its breath, waiting for winter to punish him for it. Yet Silas had a quiet confidence, the sort born not from pride but from memory. He'd spent years drifting across mountain towns as a blacksmith's apprentice, slept in line camps with nothing but a wool blanket and a dream, and watched more than one rancher freeze because they trusted firewood more than sunlight. Those lessons never left him. They simmered inside him like embers under ash, waiting for the right moment to flare into something new. That moment arrived on a crisp autumn morning, when Silas walked into town carrying a bundle of salvaged window frames under one arm and an idea under the other. Part 2. The idea everyone mocked. Nobody truly knows when Silas first decided to build his odd invention. Some say he got the idea from a mining camp greenhouse he'd helped repair years earlier. Others swear he'd lost a bet with himself. What we do know is that the moment he unloaded those dusty frames behind his cabin, the whole valley began whispering. A man gathering glass out on the frontier was like a preacher gathering rattlesnakes. Something strange was bound to follow. Silas marked the ground with his boot heel, scratched out a rough rectangle facing true south, and started setting posts without telling a soul why. When Jed Barnes, his nearest neighbor, rode by and saw the skeleton of the structure rising out of the sagebrush, he nearly fell off his horse laughing. "Silas," he called, wiping tears from his eyes. "You building a sun parlor or a chicken coffin?" Silas didn't look up. He drove another nail into the frame, calm as a monk. Jed shook his head. "Ain't no sunlight gonna warm a Wyoming winter. You know that, right?" But Silas only muttered, "You don't need to warm all of Wyoming. Just one man's cabin." Word spread fast. Folks stopped by just to gawk at the old-timer's glass contraption. A few joked that they should start digging him a grave early since he clearly wanted a see-through coffin. Others figured he'd finally lost his grip on reality, building something so fragile in a land where even rock freezes to dust. By the end of the week, Silas had earned himself a new nickname, Crystal Silas. And not one person meant it kindly. But here's the thing about people who think differently. They see what others ignore. And Silas had spent too many winters watching firewood vanish faster than daylight, too many nights feeling cold crawl under the door like a thief. He'd learned something important, something the rest of the valley had forgotten. Sunlight may be weak in winter, but it is faithful. It shows up every single day, even if you can't see it behind the clouds. And when sunlight hits the right surface, and that surface hits the right mass, and that mass sits behind the right door, well, you can build yourself a room that traps warmth the way a snare traps rabbits. So Silas kept building. Through wind and taunts and sideways glances, he pressed on. Because he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't chasing applause or trying to prove the valley wrong. He was simply preparing for the kind of winter he knew was coming. The kind you only survive if you're willing to think ahead while others laugh behind your back. And soon enough, winter would arrive to settle the argument once and for all. Part 3. Building a glass room in a land built of cold. Silas didn't start with a blueprint, at least not the kind a surveyor would understand. His plans lived in the same place as his stubbornness, somewhere between instinct and memory. He drove the first post into the frozen dirt with the rhythm of a man who had swung a hammer his entire life. Then he braced the second, aligning both by the shadow cast at mid-morning. To Silas, shadows were truer than measuring tapes. A shadow never lies about where the sun wants to go. He worked slow, the way old men do, not because they lack strength, but because they refuse to waste any. Every part had a purpose. Every joint had meaning. He joined two rough beams into a slope pointed toward the southern sky, that same angle he'd seen in a forgotten greenhouse outside Helena decades ago. He didn't know the science behind passive solar collection, but he understood it the way a wolf understands wind direction, through lived experience, through failure, through survival. The structure grew day by day, and with each pane of glass Silas fitted into the frame, the valley's laughter got a little louder. The children dared each other to sneak close and tap the glass. Their mothers pulled them back, whispering about the mad old man who's fixing to freeze. Jed Barnes stopped by daily now, shaking his head in disbelief. "Silas, you rebuilding the Crystal Palace out here?" He joked, leaning in the doorway of the cabin. But even Jed noticed something peculiar that he didn't speak of. Silas wasn't just nailing boards together. He was placing things, big things, inside the structure. 3 enormous barrels sat against the cabin wall, each filled to the brim with water. Silas had painted them black with a mix of soot and linseed oil, the same mixture he once used to seal wagon wheels. Jed asked him once what they were for. Silas simply answered, "Nighttime." That didn't help Jed understand anything, but it sent a chill through him all the same. Silas packed the floor with earth, darkening it with ash until it looked like a forge left after a long night's work. The inside smelled of dust, wood, and the faint metallic scent of water in winter. Silas would stand there sometimes, hands on hips, breath fogging, imagining the cold months ahead. He wasn't building a shed. He was building a trap for sunlight, a trap for warmth, a trap for survival. And though his neighbors didn't know it, every scoop of dirt and every shovelful of ash was Silas quietly rewriting the rules of frontier living. Not loud enough to silence the mockery, just loud enough to matter when the sky turned mean. Part 4. The first tests of a strange machine. Early winter always comes politely. A thin frost on the grass, a line of ice along the trough, a soft reminder that things are about to get serious. And during those first cold mornings, Silas began to test what he'd built. The sun climbed low, dragging its golden light across the ridge before touching the glass. As soon as it did, the shed brightened, then warmed. The barrels, cold as stone at dawn, began to swallow heat, the way Silas once swallowed whiskey in his youth. Slow, deliberate, aching for more. Within an hour, the temperature inside the shed climbed past 60. By midday, with the air outside barely touching 40, the shed sat at 85 degrees, warm enough to make Silas roll up his sleeves. Jed Barnes arrived just in time to witness this. He stepped inside the structure and blinked, his face softening as if he'd stumbled into some hidden sanctuary. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, wiping his beard. "Feels like Kansas in here." Silas nodded but didn't celebrate. He was too busy writing numbers on a small piece of scrap paper he kept tucked into his vest. Every hour, he took another reading. Every night, he noted how long the barrels held heat. These weren't the habits of a madman. These were the habits of a man who'd spent his life learning that nature rewards the prepared and punishes the proud. Still, the valley kept laughing. A few men suggested the shed might double as a bathhouse if Silas ever figured out plumbing. The general store's owner joked that maybe he'd start selling sunglasses for anyone brave enough to stand near Silas's glass inferno. But none of them were there at dusk, when the sun slipped behind the ridge and the warmth didn't leave. The shed cooled, sure, but not like the open air. The barrels glowed with stored heat, releasing it little by little. When Silas stepped through the inner door into his cabin, he felt warm air follow him, pushing gently into the room like an obedient dog returning home. He stoked the stove only briefly, then let the cabin do the rest. The nights grew longer, the tests grew clearer. Silas was no longer guessing. He was measuring, learning, sharpening his invention the way he once sharpened iron at the forge. And still, winter hadn't truly arrived. Not yet. Part 5, when winter opened its teeth. The real cold came without warning, as it always does. One moment, the valley was quiet, deceptively calm under a blanket of pale clouds. The next, the sky broke open like a torn canvas and spilled a storm so fierce that birds froze mid-flight. The wind howled across the plains, dragging knives of ice through every crack in every cabin door. Smoke bent sideways. Horses refused to leave their shelters. Mothers stuffed blankets into window gaps, while men cursed at stubborn stoves that never seemed to burn hot enough. This was the kind of cold that didn't just visit. It conquered. Jed's cabin dropped to 42 degrees by dawn, despite burning wood all night until the stove glowed red. A mile down the valley, the Wilkerson family reported ice forming inside their water bucket. Even the cattle huddled together and bawled, something they only did when death walked close. But over at Silas Merrick's place, something strange was happening. The storm raged just as fiercely there, yet his cabin windows glowed faintly with a warmth that didn't belong in winter. The old man stepped through his shed that morning, boots crunching on the frost that hugged the floor, and read the thermometer. Inside the shed, 73 degrees. Inside the cabin, 71. Outside, -12 and falling. Silas didn't smile often, but he smiled then. This wasn't luck. This wasn't chance. This was proof. Quiet, undeniable proof that sunlight captured properly could outfight winter. Proof that water, stone, and glass, arranged with intent, could outperform the biggest woodpile. Proof that understanding nature is sometimes more powerful than trying to overpower it. The valley hadn't learned the lesson yet, but they would. Because the storm that had arrived was only the beginning. And before the winter ended, more than warmth would be tested out here. Lives would be. Part 6. A winter the frontier had not seen in a generation. Winter deepened its claws with a cruelty that even the oldest ranch hands couldn't remember. The storm that arrived that week didn't pass through like a traveler. It settled over the valley and made itself at home, dragging temperatures lower each night until the very air seemed to crack under the strain. Folks started calling it the Blue Winter, on account of how the sky turned a strange iron blue color right before each cold wave pushed down from the mountains. For 7 days, the sun appeared only as a pale smudge behind a wall of blowing snow. Woodpiles shrank faster than anyone expected. Children cried through the night because even thick quilts couldn't stop the cold from creeping in. And every morning, men stepped outside to see fences bowed by ice and their breath hanging like smoke in the still air. Jed Barnes was one of the first to feel the winter's bite. His cabin, solid, heavy-timbered, built with pride, could barely keep its main room above 45 degrees, even with the stove gobbling fuel like a starving beast. His wife wrapped their youngest in 3 blankets, yet the child's fingers stayed cold and stiff. Jed cursed the wind, cursed the frost, cursed the winter, and, though he'd never admit it, cursed the old fool up the ridge who never seemed to worry about the things that kept other men awake at night. Down the valley, the Miller family's chimney cracked from the heat stress of burning wood nonstop. 5 cabins reported frozen wells. One man nearly lost a hand when he slipped while chopping ice from a trough. The frontier was revealing its teeth now, and each day felt like a contest between will and weather. But on the 8th morning of the blue winter, something extraordinary happened. The sky finally cracked open. A thin blade of sunlight pierced through the clouds and sliced across Silas Merrick's glass shed. And the shed woke up. The moment sunlight hit the panes, the air inside brightened, then shifted, then warmed with a slow, deliberate certainty, like a sleeping animal roused by an old instinct. Silas stood inside, watching the temperature climb from 50 to 60 to 70 in barely 2 hours. He placed his palm on one of the blackened barrels, felt the heat seep in, and nodded quietly to himself. This was the day the shed was built for. By noon, the cabin itself sat at a smooth, steady 80 degrees. Silas didn't add a single stick of firewood. The stove rested cold. The old man cooked his beans in the warm air alone. While the valley fought to keep frost off their windows, Silas aired out blankets, oiled his tools, and watched the blizzard melt from his boots. A winter strong enough to break the back of a region couldn't so much as nip at his heels. And though he didn't know it yet, that warmth would soon save more than just his own life. Part 7. The night Jed Barnes begged the man he mocked. The coldest night of the blue winter arrived without warning. No wind at first, no cloud bank rolling in. Just a slow, merciless drop in temperature that sent animals restless and made every door hinge moan. Jed Barnes went to bed uneasy, and by midnight he knew why. The fire had died. The stove, exhausted from days of constant use, had cracked along its lower seam. Smoke billowed through the cabin as the draft collapsed. Jed's wife grabbed the children, coughing, trying to usher them toward the door, but the instant she cracked it open, a blast of air colder than death itself slammed into them. Snow whipped in sideways. Even the lantern flame curled and died. Jed looked at his youngest boy, small, pale, barely 8 years old, his fingertips turning the waxy white of early frostbite. In that moment, pride lost all its value. There was only one place within miles warm enough to save that boy's hands, and it belonged to the man Jed had mocked for weeks. Jed wrapped the child in blankets, lifted him into his arms, and plunged into the storm. The wind clawed at him, tearing at his coat, trying to push him back. Snow blinded him. Every breath stabbed his lungs. But a man running to save his child doesn't feel the cold the way other men do. He ran until his legs buckled, crawled until his hands bled, and when he finally reached the ridge, the storm parted just enough for him to see it, the faint amber glow of Silas's glass shed. He stumbled toward it, the boy limp in his arms, and flung himself against the outer door. It opened, and warmth, real, living warmth, rushed over them like a summer wave. Jed collapsed on the dirt floor, sobbing as feeling returned to his frozen fingers. Silas appeared in the inner doorway. He didn't ask questions. He didn't scold. He didn't gloat. He simply said, "Bring the boy closer to the barrels. They'll warm him faster than the stove." Jed laid his son near the radiant heat. The child's hands, white and stiff, began to pinken. His breathing steadied. His eyes fluttered open. Jed swallowed hard, tears streaking his frost-burned beard. "Silas," he whispered, voice breaking. "I was wrong." The old man placed a hand on Jed's shoulder. It was warm, steady. "Winter doesn't care who's right," he said softly, "but it always shows us who was prepared." In that moment, Jed understood more than survival. He understood humility and gratitude and the wisdom of a man who saw further than the laughter of neighbors. Part 8. The Science. A frontier man never called science. The next morning, when the storm finally loosened its grip, Jed sat beside the barrels, his thawing son sleeping peacefully. Silas brewed coffee, thick, dark, frontier coffee, and poured Jed a tin cup. Steam rose between them like a quiet truce. Jed looked around the shed, now bright with morning light. "How in God's name did you know this would work?" he asked. Silas chuckled under his breath. "I didn't," he said. "I just knew the suns never once failed to show up. Couldn't say the same about stoves." Then he began to explain, not with charts or numbers, but in the simple wisdom of a man who had lived close to the wind for far too long. He tapped one of the barrels. Water holds heat better than anything a homesteader can afford. Give it sunlight, and it'll pay you back all night long. He pointed at the dark floor. The earth's a better partner than folks realize. Darken it, and it'll swallow warmth like a bear before hibernation. He ran a hand along the inner doorframe. And these two doors? That's just common sense. Don't invite winter in. Make it knock twice. Jed nodded, absorbing each lesson like they were gospel. Silas wasn't done. You folks spend all winter fighting nature, he said gently. But nature ain't the enemy, it's the teacher. You watch it long enough, you start seeing its habits. And once you know its habits, you can work with them. That was the heart of Silas Merrick's brilliance. He wasn't rebelling against the frontier. He was cooperating with it. A principle as old as stone, yet forgotten by men too busy chopping wood to look at the sun. Jed looked around the shining room, its glass walls, its glowing barrels, its soft, radiant heat, and realized the truth. This wasn't a shed. It was a lesson in survival, disguised as a structure, a blueprint for a new kind of frontier living. And before winter ended, this lesson would spread far beyond Silas's ridge. Part 9, when a valley changed its mind. The storm finally broke 2 days later. The sky thinned from iron gray to a timid silver, and the wind retreated into the canyons like a beast returning to its den. Folks emerged from their cabins with frost-bitten fingers, hollow cheeks, and the shaken look of people who had stared too closely at the edge between life and loss. It didn't take long for word to spread. Jed Barnes, once the loudest voice mocking Silas, now spoke of him with a reverence usually reserved for men of Scripture. Silas saved my boy's hands, he told anyone who'd listen. Saved his life too. He repeated the story so many times that even the men who'd mocked Silas hardest began to fall quiet. They weren't just hearing about a clever shed anymore. They were hearing about a miracle. A few of them walked up the ridge to see the glass room themselves. Some came timidly, hats in hand, while others pretended they were just passing through. But the moment they stepped inside, their breath vanished, or rather, it no longer fogged. They felt the warmth hit their faces like a memory of summer. They saw the barrels, the ash-darkened floor, the double doors, and the steady old man tending to his tools with sleeves rolled up in the dead of winter. One rancher took off his gloves and said, "Feels like cheating the cold." Silas only shrugged. "Cold ain't something you beat," he said gently. "It's something you outthink." Another asked how much wood he'd burned during the storm. Silas shook his head. Didn't need any. The valley men looked at one another, their faces shifting from disbelief to envy to something else, something like respect. The more they asked, the more Silas showed. He wasn't protective of his secret. He wasn't a man who hoarded knowledge. What good is warmth if you keep it to yourself on a frontier this cruel? So he taught them how to angle a roof, how to place the barrels, how to darken the floor properly. He showed them where the wind blew hardest during storms, and how to build the airlock so no gust could steal their heat. Soon, these hardened frontiermen, men who once laughed at glass, began collecting old window frames from abandoned shacks. Some tore down chicken coops for lumber. Others traded spare tools for panes of glass at the general store. Within a week, 3 families had begun building structures of their own. A shift had begun, a quiet revolution, not the kind that makes noise, but the kind that changes a place forever. Silas never asked for credit. He never wanted it. But everyone who stepped into his shed knew one thing with absolute certainty. The old man had been right all along. Part 10. A year later, the valley bloomed in winter. When the snows melted and spring finally brushed the valley with its pale green fingers, the memory of the blue winter still clung to every fence post and window shutter. But that next autumn, something extraordinary happened. Glass sheds started appearing like stubborn wildflowers. 6 stood in the valley before the first frost, 9 by the end of October, 12 by the start of winter. Each one a little different. Some built tight and small, others tall and wide, some using oiled cloth instead of glass, but all crafted with the same spirit, survival blended with ingenuity. The Barnes family built theirs first, with Jed cutting every board by hand as if repaying a personal debt to the land. His son, fingers now healed and strong, painted the barrels himself. The Wilkersons followed, making an extended version with space to dry laundry in winter. A bachelor down the creek even built his shed big enough to store his saddles and tack, boasting that his gear hadn't frozen once since. By Christmas time, the valley felt different. Children played inside warm sheds while snow piled high outside. Women dried herbs and mended clothes without numb fingers. Men sharpened tools in warm air instead of fighting frozen metal. The frontier, for the first time in memory, felt a touch more forgiving. And all of it, every shed, every improvement, every warm evening during a freezing week, led back to a quiet man on a lonely ridge who had looked at the sun and seen possibility where others saw foolishness. When spring came again, the valley gathered for its annual meeting at the old Grange Hall. Neighbors brought food, shared stories, and shook hands with new respect. Someone, not Jed, not the preacher, but a young mother whose child had survived a fever thanks to the warmth of their shed, asked Silas to stand and speak. He did so reluctantly, leaning on a cane he'd carved from juniper. "I didn't build that shed to be clever," Silas said softly. "I built it because I was tired of losing to winter. Out here, the land'll take anything from you if you let it. But it also gives. Sunlight, even in winter, is still a gift." He paused, letting the room breathe. "You don't survive a place like this by fighting everything. You survive by learning what wants to help you and what wants to hurt you. The sun don't owe us a thing, but it shows up every day anyway. Might as well learn from that." There were no cheers, no applause, just a long, quiet nod from everyone in the room. The kind of silence that honors truth. Part 11, Outro, the lesson Silas left behind. Years later, when Silas was gone and his cabin belonged to the prairie again, the valley still spoke his name, the way people speak of an old trail they no longer walk, but never forget. The glass shed stood longer than the cabin, long enough to gather weeds in its corners, and long enough for children to peek through the dusty panes and hear their parents whisper, "That's the place where an old man once caught the sun." Visitors would sometimes come, curious about the legend. They'd stand in the shed during winter, letting the warmth soak in, feeling the sunlight bounce from barrel to floor. And even those born long after Silas's time could sense it. The presence of a mind that looked at nature not with suspicion, but with partnership. Silas Merrick didn't invent solar heating. He didn't know the equations of thermal mass or the geometry of winter sun angles. But he understood something deeper. Something every modern homesteader, survivalist, or gardener must remember. Nature favors those who pay attention. Warmth comes to those who prepare. And on the frontier, old or new, wisdom rarely shouts. It shows itself quietly, in a man who builds with intention, in a valley that learns to listen, in a winter that fails to break you because you knew how to bend before it arrived. So when cold seasons come into your own life, whether in weather, work, or hardship, remember Silas's shed. Remember the barrels gathering sunlight, the glass capturing warmth, the old man keeping notes like his life depended on it. And remember this truth: sometimes the thing the world laughs at is the very thing that saves it. Thanks for riding with Frontier Ways today. If Silas's lessons spoke to you, stick around. Out here, we've got more stories carved from wind, wood, and wisdom. Stories that might just make your own world a little warmer.